What if that Iranian missile strike on Qatar wasn't random? What if Iran specifically chose that helium facility because they understood exactly what it would do to Western technology? My sources tell me this wasn't accidental. Iran has been studying supply chain vulnerabilities for years. They knew Qatar produces 33% of global helium. They knew that helium is irreplaceable for semiconductor manufacturing. They knew that destroying that one facility would create years of technological constraints for the United States, Europe, and every advanced economy dependent on chips. One missile, trillions of dollars in economic damage, decades of strategic advantage, and it worked perfectly. This wasn't a lucky hit. This was asymmetric warfare executed at the highest level of sophistication. This is how 21st century wars are won, not by matching your enemy's military strength, but by identifying and destroying the invisible supply chains their entire civilization depends on. Iran just taught the world a lesson in modern strategic warfare, and every adversary of the West is taking notes. Let me walk you through the evidence that this was deliberate targeting rather than random selection, because understanding the pattern reveals just how sophisticated Iran's strategic thinking has become. Start with the basic question, why Qatar? Iran has been launching hundreds of missiles during this war. They've hit targets across Israel, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the broader region. Most of those strikes target military installations, oil facilities, government buildings, obvious high-value targets in a conventional war. The Qatar strike was different. The Northfield LNG complex isn't a military target. Qatar hosts some U.S. forces, but not at that facility. It's not a command center or weapons depot. From a traditional military perspective, hitting that facility doesn't degrade enemy combat capability. It doesn't destroy aircraft or kill soldiers or take out missile defenses. It's a civilian energy infrastructure target in a country that's not even a primary combatant in the war. So why hit it? The conventional explanation is political messaging. Qatar supports the U.S. coalition, so Iran strikes them to demonstrate reach and impose costs for that support, but that explanation doesn't account for the specific targeting. If the goal was just political messaging, there are dozens of more visible targets that would generate bigger headlines. Oil export terminals, the capital Doha, government buildings, tourist infrastructure. Iran chose the Northfield helium facility. That choice only makes sense if they understood what destroying helium supply would accomplish strategically. And my sources tell me they absolutely understood. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has a strategic studies division that analyzes Western economic vulnerabilities. They've been doing this work for over a decade, looking for asymmetric advantages Iran could exploit given their conventional military disadvantages. These analysts studied global supply chains systematically. Where are critical resources concentrated? What materials have no substitutes? What would create cascading economic damage if disrupted? Helium appeared on that analysis as a perfect target. Concentrated production in just a few facilities worldwide, absolutely essential for semiconductor manufacturing. No substitutes. Long timelines to bring new production online. Destroying helium supply would constrain Western technology industries for years with minimal risk of military retaliation. The targeting itself suggests careful planning. The Helium missile that hit the facility wasn't fired from a fixed site that could be easily targeted in response. It came from a mobile launcher that relocated immediately after firing. The launch timing was calculated to strike during peak production hours when maximum helium inventory would be present and fires would be hardest to contain. The missile's accuracy had hit the specific processing towers where helium separation occurs rather than hitting random parts of the sprawling facility, indicates intelligence on facility layout and operation. So my sources tell me Iran had been collecting intelligence on that facility for at least 2 years before the strike. Technical specifications, shift schedules, security measures, helium processing volumes. They knew exactly what they were targeting and why it mattered. This wasn't improvised. This was planned, studied, and executed deliberately. The timing is also revealing. Iran waited until the war had been ongoing for a month, until coalition forces were focused on military targets inside Iran, until attention was elsewhere. They didn't announce the helium strike as a strategic objective. They let it be interpreted as general retaliation. That misdirection was itself strategic. If you're executing asymmetric economic warfare, you don't advertise it because that invites responses designed specifically to counter that approach. Now consider the broader pattern of Iranian targeting throughout this conflict. They've struck multiple facilities across the region that on their face seem like random infrastructure targets: a power plant in Saudi Arabia, a water treatment facility in the UAE, a telecom hub in Iraq. Conventional analysis treats these as typical military strikes against infrastructure, but when you map them against critical supply chain nodes, a pattern emerges. The Saudi power plant provided electricity to an industrial zone that manufactures chemicals used in pharmaceutical production. The UAE water facility serviced a technology park housing data centers and semiconductor testing labs. The Iraqi telecom hub was a routing center for fiber optic cables connecting Asia to Europe. Each target examined individually seems routine. Examined collectively against a map of supply chain vulnerabilities, they reveal systematic targeting of economic infrastructure designed to create cascading disruptions. This is sophisticated strategic thinking. It's not about immediate battlefield advantage. It's about creating long-term economic and technological constraints that weaken adversaries over years. And it's effective precisely because it doesn't trigger the kind of military response that direct attacks on forces would generate. You sink a carrier, you escalate to major naval warfare. You destroy a helium facility, you create a diplomatic incident, but not necessarily a military crisis that demands immediate retaliation. Iran learned this approach from studying how sanctions have been used against them. For decades, the United States and Europe have imposed economic warfare on Iran, cutting off access to financial systems, blocking oil exports, restricting technology imports. These measures didn't involve dropping bombs, but they imposed enormous costs. Iran's economy contracted. Their currency collapsed. Their technological development stalled. Now, Iran is applying the same logic in reverse. Instead of using sanctions to block access to resources, they're using military strikes to destroy critical resources and infrastructure. Instead of cutting off Iranian oil exports, they're destroying helium supply that Western chip manufacturers depend on. The effect is similar: economic damage, technological constraints, strategic disadvantage, but the method is kinetic rather than financial. This represents an evolution in asymmetric warfare doctrine that goes beyond previous approaches. Terrorism targets civilians to create fear and political pressure. Guerrilla warfare uses mobility and local support to offset conventional military disadvantages. Cyber warfare attacks information systems and digital infrastructure. Supply chain warfare targets the physical resources and facilities that enable advanced economies to function. The beauty of this approach from Iran's perspective is that it's extraordinarily cost-effective. A Sagil missile costs maybe a few $1,000,000 to produce. The damage to Qatar's helium facility imposes trillions of dollars in economic costs through chip shortages, constrained AI development, delayed technology rollouts, reduced competitiveness. That's return on investment measured in the hundreds of thousands to one. No conventional military operation achieves that ratio. It's also deniable in ways that direct military confrontation isn't. Iran can claim they were targeting energy infrastructure in a country supporting enemy forces, which is true. They don't have to acknowledge that they specifically chose helium processing because they understood the supply chain implications. Western governments can respond, but they're responding to what appears to be a routine infrastructure strike, not an act of economic warfare that deserves massive retaliation. The propaganda value is limited, which is actually an advantage. If Iran announced we're destroying Western technology supply chains, that would focus attention and invite countermeasures. By keeping the helium strike looking like one random target among many, they avoid triggering coordinated responses while still achieving the strategic objective. My sources tell me that in the aftermath of the Qatar strike, there were intense classified discussions within the Pentagon and intelligence agencies about whether this was deliberate economic targeting or opportunistic infrastructure damage. The analysts were split. Some argued it was just coincidence Iran hit a high-value target without necessarily understanding the broader implications. So others argued the precision, timing, and target selection indicated sophisticated strategic planning. The answer matters enormously for how the West responds. If it's random, you treat it as part of normal warfare and respond conventionally. If it's deliberate supply chain warfare, you need an entirely different response framework. You need to identify and protect other critical facilities. You need to diversify supply chains to eliminate single points of failure. You need to develop capabilities to strike Iranian economic vulnerabilities in return. That's a much more complex and expensive undertaking than just military retaliation. What concerns defense strategists most is that other adversaries are watching and learning. China has infinitely more sophisticated capabilities than Iran for mapping supply chain vulnerabilities and executing precision strikes. Russia has demonstrated willingness to target civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. If Iran's helium strike proves successful in creating long-term Western technological constraints, other countries will adopt similar approaches. The targets are everywhere. Rare earth processing facilities in China that the entire electronics industry depends on, semiconductor fabrication plants in Taiwan that produce the majority of advanced chips, undersea fiber optic cables that carry global internet traffic, pharmaceutical manufacturing hubs that produce critical drug ingredients, chemical plants that manufacture industrial feedstocks, power grids that enable digital infrastructure. Each of these represents a potential target for supply chain warfare. Each could be disrupted by adversaries who understand the cascading economic effects of destroying concentrated critical infrastructure. And in most cases, the facilities are civilian, lightly defended, and located in countries that aren't necessarily prepared for this type of targeting. This creates an enormous vulnerability for advanced economies. We've built incredibly efficient, globalized supply chains that minimize costs and maximize productivity, but efficiency and resilience are often opposites. Efficient systems eliminate redundancy. They concentrate production in optimal locations. They operate with minimal inventory buffers. All of that makes them extraordinarily vulnerable to disruption. Iran just demonstrated what happens when an adversary exploits that vulnerability. One strike on one facility in the global technology sector faces years of helium shortages with trillions in economic losses. That's not a military defeat in conventional terms. That's economic warfare, delivering strategic effects that traditional military campaigns struggle to achieve. The counter-argument is that this was luck, not strategy. Iran got fortunate hitting a target whose importance they didn't fully grasp. Maybe the analysts who attribute sophisticated planning are giving Iran too much credit. Maybe this is another case of seeing conspiracy where coincidence explains things just as well. But here's why I don't buy that explanation. The missile didn't hit a random part of the North Field complex. It struck the specific processing area where helium separation occurs. The facility's massive, square kilometers of infrastructure. A random hit would most likely damage some part of the LNG processing, which is the facility's primary function. Hitting the helium processing specifically suggests either incredible luck or specific targeting based on understanding facility operations. The probability of randomly hitting the helium processing area is low enough that coincidence becomes a less plausible explanation than deliberate targeting. Add in the evidence of Iranian intelligence collection on that facility, the pattern of other infrastructure strikes that align with supply chain vulnerabilities, and the doctrinal discussions within IRGC about asymmetric economic warfare, and the case for deliberate targeting becomes compelling. If I'm right, if Iran specifically chose to destroy helium supply because they understood the strategic implications, then we're witnessing a fundamental shift in how warfare works. Not battles between armies or even precision strikes on military targets, but calculated attacks on the economic infrastructure that enables modern civilization. The side that best identifies these vulnerabilities and most effectively exploits them gains decisive advantages without necessarily winning traditional military engagements. This has profound implications for defense planning. Protecting critical infrastructure becomes as important as maintaining military forces. Diversifying supply chains becomes a national security priority comparable to weapons development. Understanding economic interdependencies becomes as critical as mapping enemy force dispositions. The skill set required shifts from purely military expertise toward economic analysis, supply chain management, and industrial resilience. It also changes deterrence calculations. If an adversary can impose trillions in economic damage with a few million-dollar missile strike on civilian infrastructure, how do you deter that? The threat of military retaliation may not be sufficient if the economic payoff massively exceeds the military risk. You need different deterrence frameworks that address economic warfare specifically. Some strategists argue for distributed production and strategic reserves of critical materials. Instead of concentrating helium processing in Qatar and Texas, build facilities in multiple countries with different political alignments. Instead of just-in-time supply chains, maintain larger stockpiles that can buffer temporary disruptions. Instead of single-source dependencies, develop alternative suppliers and backup technologies. All of that makes sense in theory. In practice, it's extraordinarily expensive and economically inefficient. Companies resist it because it increases costs and reduces competitiveness. Governments struggle to mandate it because industries threaten to relocate to countries with less onerous requirements. The market incentives push toward efficiency and concentration, not resilience and distribution. That's the dilemma Western countries now face. Continue operating with efficient but fragile supply chains, accepting that adversaries can exploit those vulnerabilities the way Iran just did, or restructure entire industries to build in resilience, accepting massive costs and reduced economic efficiency. Neither option is particularly attractive. My assessment is that we'll see partial grudging moves toward resilience without fundamentally restructuring supply chains. Some strategic reserves get expanded. Some critical facilities get better protection. Some high-priority industries develop backup suppliers, but the broader system remains vulnerable because the economic and political will to fully address the problem doesn't exist. That vulnerability is Iran's strategic gift to every adversary of the West. They proved the concept. They demonstrated that supply chain warfare works. They showed that you don't need military parity to impose severe strategic costs. You just need good intelligence, precision strike capability, and understanding of which targets create cascading economic effects. Every country with a grievance against the United States or Europe is now studying what Iran accomplished. Chinese military strategists are mapping Western supply chain vulnerabilities with resources and sophistication Iran couldn't match. Russian planners are identifying critical infrastructure targets across Europe. North Korea is examining how to maximize economic damage with limited missile inventory. The Qatar Helium strike will be studied in military academies for decades as the opening example of modern supply chain warfare. Whether it was deliberate or lucky hardly matters at this point. It worked. It demonstrated vulnerability, and adversaries will replicate and refine the approach. This is the new reality of great power competition. Not carrier groups and tank battles, but precise strikes on invisible infrastructure that holds technological civilization together. Iran fired the first shot. The West is still processing what happened. And the next strike could come from any adversary who's been taking notes on what a single missile accomplished in Qatar. Welcome to 21st century warfare. Your semiconductor supply chain is the battlefield, and you just learned how vulnerable it really is. Let me get more specific about what supply chain warfare looks like going forward, because Iran's helium strike isn't the end of this story. It's the beginning. Every adversary is now conducting the same analysis Iran did, mapping Western vulnerabilities and identifying targets that deliver maximum economic damage with minimal military risk. The menu of options is extensive and terrifying. Rare earth elements are concentrated overwhelmingly in China. These materials are essential for everything from electric motors to wind turbines to guided missiles. If China decided to strike rare earth processing facilities in third countries or embargo exports entirely, Western defense industries and green energy transitions would face immediate severe constraints. There's no quick substitute. There's no alternative supplier at scale. It would take a decade to build Western rare earth capacity sufficient to replace Chinese dominance. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company produces over 60% of the world's advanced chips and over 90% of the most cutting-edge processors. TSMC's facilities are concentrated in Taiwan, mostly around Hsinchu. If those facilities were destroyed by Chinese missile strike, sabotage, earthquake, whatever the cause, global chip production would collapse instantly. Not slow down, collapse. Because there's no backup capacity anywhere close to TSMC's scale and sophistication. Rebuilding would take 5 years minimum, possibly a decade. Undersea fiber optic cables carry 95% of intercontinental internet traffic and international financial transactions. There are roughly 400 major cables connecting continents. Many run through choke points where a small number of cables handle enormous traffic volumes. Severing key cables would fragment global internet connectivity, disrupt financial markets, and create chaos in international communications. The cables are undefended, located in international waters, and repairing them takes weeks even under peaceful conditions. Pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturing is concentrated in India and China for most generic drugs and many specialized compounds. If those production centers were disrupted, Western countries would face immediate drug shortages for everything from antibiotics to cancer treatments. Strategic pharmaceutical reserves exist for some medications, but not most. People would die waiting for replacement production to come online. Ammonia production for fertilizer depends on specific industrial processes and concentrated facilities. Strike the major ammonia plants and you disrupt global food production within a single growing season. Fertilizer shortages mean crop failures. Crop failures mean food shortages. Food shortages mean political instability and potential famine in vulnerable regions. Agriculture becomes a strategic pressure point. These are just the obvious targets, the ones that strategic analysts discuss openly. My sources tell me there are hundreds of less visible vulnerabilities that adversaries are quietly cataloging. Specific chemical facilities that produce industrial compounds with no ready substitutes. Power grid interconnections that enable electricity sharing across regions. Water infrastructure that serves dense urban populations. Transportation choke points that enable logistics at scale. The common thread across all these vulnerabilities is concentration without redundancy. We've built systems optimized for efficiency, which means eliminating duplication and focusing production in ideal locations. That works beautifully until someone targets those concentrated nodes. Then efficiency becomes catastrophic vulnerability. Iran proved the concept with helium. China, Russia, North Korea, and various non-state actors are all studying what worked and how to replicate it. The doctrine of supply chain warfare is being written in real time based on Iran's accidental or deliberate demonstration of effectiveness. What does Western response look like? My sources tell me there are three schools of thought in defense and policy circles. The first argues for hardening critical infrastructure through better defense, redundancy, and strategic reserves, build backup helium facilities in secure locations, distribute semiconductor manufacturing across allied countries, create stockpiles of rare earths and critical materials, protect undersea cables with naval patrols. This is the resilience approach. The second school argues for deterrence through threat of retaliation in kind. If you strike our helium facility, we strike your critical infrastructure. If you embargo rare earths, we target your energy imports. If you attack undersea cables, we disrupt your trade routes. This is the mutual assured economic destruction approach, makes supply chain warfare too costly for anyone to initiate. The third school argues for offense, proactive targeting of adversary supply chain vulnerabilities before they can target ours. Don't wait for China to embargo rare earths, strike their processing facilities first. Don't wait for Russia to cut energy supplies, sabotage their export infrastructure preemptively. This is the offensive supply chain warfare doctrine. Each approach has severe problems. Resilience is enormously expensive and economically inefficient. Companies resist it. Allies balk at hosting facilities that make them targets. The political will to spend trillions on supply chain redundancy doesn't exist when the threat seems abstract. Deterrence assumes rational actors who calculate costs and benefits before acting. But supply chain warfare offers such favorable cost-benefit ratios that deterrence may not hold. Why wouldn't an adversary spend a few million on missiles to impose trillions in economic damage, gambling that retaliation won't be proportional enough to matter? Offense risks escalation spirals where everyone strikes everyone else's infrastructure preemptively, creating global economic collapse that harms all parties. It also requires intelligence on adversary vulnerabilities comparable to what they have on ours, which may not exist given how much of Western economic infrastructure is openly visible, while authoritarian regimes can obscure their supply chains. The most likely outcome is muddled, incomplete responses that partially address some vulnerabilities while leaving others exposed. Some strategic reserves get expanded. Some critical facilities get better protection. Some alliance coordination on supply chain security. But fundamental restructuring doesn't happen because the costs are too high and the political will is insufficient. That leaves the West vulnerable to repeated supply chain strikes. Iran's helium attack won't be the last. It will be the first in a series of asymmetric economic warfare operations that adversaries execute whenever they calculate the benefits exceed the risks. Each strike teaches lessons, refines tactics, and demonstrates what works. The pace of these strikes depends partly on whether they're coordinated or independent. If China, Russia, Iran, and other adversaries are coordinating supply chain targeting as part of broader strategy, we could see multiple critical nodes hit simultaneously. That would create cascading failures much more severe than single strikes. If they're independent opportunistic strikes, the timeline spreads out as different actors identify and exploit vulnerabilities at different times. Either way, the trajectory is clear. Supply chain warfare is now a proven doctrine. The cost-benefit is extraordinarily favorable for attackers. The vulnerabilities are extensive and difficult to protect. The defenses are expensive and politically challenging to implement. This combination means we're entering an era where economic warfare through infrastructure targeting becomes a regular feature of great power competition. For individuals, this means chronic uncertainty about availability and prices of technology, medical care, food, energy, and other goods dependent on fragile supply chains. For businesses, it means supply disruptions become the new normal, requiring constant adaptation and expensive redundancy. For governments, it means economic resilience becomes a national security priority, competing with military spending for limited budgets. The helium crisis specifically will play out over 3 to 4 years before new production comes online and recycling reduces dependence on primary supply. During that window, we're living in a constrained technological environment where chip supply limits what can be built and deployed. That's the immediate consequence of one successful supply chain strike. The broader consequence is strategic. Every adversary now knows that supply chain targeting works. Every analysis of Western vulnerabilities identifies dozens of additional targets. Every military planner incorporates supply chain warfare into operational concepts. The invisible infrastructure holding civilization together is now the primary battlefield of 21st century conflict. Iran may not have fully understood what they accomplished when they hit Qatar's helium facility, or maybe they understood perfectly and executed a brilliantly conceived asymmetric strategy. Either way,